me. Good job, everyone. So let me again say welcome. Thanks for playing our little game. So my name is Katie Hutchison. I am the Student Engagement Librarian for the Brother Edmund Druin Library, and together with the Renaissance Center for Civic Engagement, we would like to officially welcome you to our program, The Keys to Combating Misinformation and Disinformation. So this is actually perfect timing because this Saturday was World Communication Day, during which Pope Francis actually told us all of us are responsible for the communications we make, for the information we share, for the control we can exert over fake news by exposing it. All of us are to be witnesses of the truth, to go, to see, and to share. So, kind of perfect timing. That was just a few days ago. Now, before I turn things over to the panelists, let's talk a little bit about truth. And for this, I'm going to borrow an analogy from American philosopher Dr. Dallas Willard's 1999 publication, Truth, Can We Live Without It?, that was published in Christian Ethics Today. And his analogy is, if someone tells you there's gas in your car tank, but then your car sputters to a stop and the gauge goes down, you don't have to climb in the tank. You know you're out of gas. And the same is, and truth is the same no matter where it shows up. It's not always verifiable like it might be with that gas tank analogy, but truth is always that matching up of an idea to reality. And that matching up will occur with truth, and it is totally indifferent to what you or I may believe. No one has ever yet made a belief true just by believing it. And Dr. Willard even suggests we try it. So just try thinking that you have gas in your car, but you'll find that it doesn't work, and it still won't work even if you get more than 2 other people to believe it with you. Now, of course, you can put gas in your tank, but you didn't do that by believing it. And that's why the statement, true for me, has been shown to be so destructive. Now, a recent poll from NPR showed that a worrying number of Americans have fallen prey to conspiracies and misinformation. And as NPR put it, the poll adds to mounting evidence that misinformation and disinformation are gaining a foothold in American society, and that conspiracy theories are unfortunately going mainstream. And I think we probably have all seen at least a couple go around since the pandemic started. Now we all know social media has had a dramatic impact in how we interact with one another. Stories and opinions can go viral with unprecedented speed. Unfortunately, the dark side to all of that is misinformation. So misinformation can influence users, manipulating them for any political or economic reasons. And the reason you're here today, of course, is how to spot that information and what you can do. So without further ado, let me introduce our esteemed faculty panelists. Each will present about a topic that is of interest to them on the broader topic of misinformation. And then there will be time for an audience Q&A after all of the panelists have presented. All right, so here are our panelists. Up first will be Dr. Tom Freeland. He is a professor of biology in our School of Arts and Sciences. He's published multiple articles on DNA and genetics and recently shared his expertise in a video explaining how physical distancing and hand washing are effective weapons against COVID-19. So I'm going to let you take it away, Dr. Freeland.
Thank you, Katie, for the invitation to join you on the panel, and just thanks for the great idea to put on this panel discussion. I think it's very much needed right now. I think it's important to recognize when people are using poor arguments, which we call rhetorical fallacies or logical fallacies. You can recognize that there's something wrong with their argument. They may be even right. Even when a person is right, you want to make sure, you want to recognize these things, recognize weaknesses in an argument. Like my guy in the cartoon, an ad hominem attack, it means attack to the person. Instead of attacking the argument or finding a flaw in the argument, you're just attacking the person. So I enjoy that cartoon. If you want to skip next. Go ahead, Katie. So logical fallacies are flawed arguments, errors in reasoning. Go ahead, keep hitting, keep punching. Katie, yes. They think, the person arguing thinks they're strengthening their argument, but if you recognize that it's a fallacy, you are armed, you won't fall for the lie, you won't fall for the fallacy if you recognize the tactics that are being used. Go ahead. Carl Sagan called this his baloney detection kit. You can look up the Carl Sagan baloney detection kit online. There's a lot more information than what I can show you here. And the more you have experience with or study these rhetorical fallacies, the better you'll be able to recognize them when you hear them and when you see them. Okay, scoot on ahead. First one, go ahead. The bandwagon approach. If somebody just tries to convince you something is true because everybody thinks so, that is a rhetorical fallacy. That doesn't mean it's true. If we go back far enough, everybody thought the earth was flat and everybody thought the sun orbited around the earth. So just because everybody thinks so doesn't mean it's true. That one's pretty easy to spot. It's a poor argument. So next, please. The slippery slope is a little bit harder to catch because sometimes it sounds reasonable. Like these two examples, that might seem like something that really happens. It's not necessarily true. Go to my next one. We've heard this argument actually from people. If you make gay marriage legal, then what's to stop a woman from marrying her dog? And then this cartoon nicely takes it to a ridiculous extreme, indicating that the slippery slope argument is just fallacious. Just because you take one step, thank you, just because you take one step, you are not destined to take further steps along the same path. That's why the slippery slope is not a good argument, it's a fallacy. Appeals to authority are tricky. Go ahead. Katy Perry thinks the killer should be pardoned. Some celebrity has an opinion. So what? President Trump said the COVID-19 pandemic is just like the flu and it will go away. Now, go ahead again. Sometimes an actual expert is telling you what that expert has figured out from data, like Dr. Fauci, his findings on the COVID-19 and the vaccine. He's an expert. He should be listened to, not because he's an authority figure, but because he's an expert on the thing he's talking about. So the appeal to authority can be tricky. Don't mistakenly think it's a rhetorical fallacy when the person speaking is truly an expert. Then we have the problem when experts, actual experts, are speaking outside their area of expertise. The Nobel Prize winning co-discoverer of DNA structure, Jim Watson, when he started talking about social issues, made a complete fool of himself. He didn't speak with authority on that topic, and he sounded like an idiot. It didn't work out for him. One of the great scientists of the 20th century was Linus Pauling, with scientific achievements beyond what most people can do, maybe second only to Albert Einstein. But when he was an older person, he started promoting mega doses of vitamin C for everyone. Well, he had a sample size of 1 and no control group. It seemed to work for him, and he was saying everybody should do it. The data did not support him, but he was such a powerful figure in science that many people thought there must be something to it. Well, there wasn't. Even experts, even scientific experts, are skeptical about authority. Go ahead, next please. Thanks for running the slides, Katie. Hard stacking is when you just leave things out of your discussion that makes it sound like your point is very strong, but it isn't because of all you've left out. Go ahead. What do I have next? Oh, card stacking. I thought I had something. Good. An example for card stacking. Oh, the one I had for card stacking was, and I didn't get it on the slide. Hey, Trump did a great job. There haven't been any new foreign entanglements with our military in the last 4 years. So what's left out? The fact that there haven't been new foreign entanglements in the last 12 years is the thing that's left out of that argument. So that kind of thing, that's a subtle thing, just to leave out bits and hoping your audience doesn't notice. Okay, now, hasty generalization is pretty common. Not too much data, but drawing a conclusion from not too much. You might be able to spot this one, but I think it's used often and maybe sometimes hard to spot. And I don't like my example either. So maybe we can all think of a better example of a hasty generalization. Okay, what's next? Begging the question is assuming that your argument is right and then using that as evidence that your argument is right. Many people misuse the phrase begging the question. When something suggests a further question, they often use the phrase begging the question, but that's not what it means. It means using your assumption that you're right as the basis for your argument. Another one, a very powerful one, the straw man fallacy, a fallacy of distraction. You mischaracterize your opponent's position to make it seem weaker than it is. So socialism is evil. Remember the Soviet Union. Well, we can make a pretty good case that the Soviet Union is equal, but to say that all types of socialism are that, well, that would be strongman. Or taking some religious claim that might be metaphorical, might not be taken seriously by most members of the religion, and using that to attack an entire religion is a strawman tactic too. Well, there are other examples of strawman. Go ahead. Appealing to emotions is pretty common. I won't wear a mask because I refuse to live in fear. So saying that I'm brave, you're not. Why are you a coward? But then the same person will often say, what's next? Go ahead. Don't take the vaccine. They're using you as a guinea pig. So in that case, I'm afraid of the vaccine. Why aren't you afraid of the vaccine? It's ironic that the same people often say both things. Go ahead. What's next? The ad hominem is attack to the man, to the arguer, which is a distraction method. Of course, you believe in healthcare for all your libtard. I've heard that one. Or just attacking the person as if that's a valid counter argument when it is never. It never is. Please, you should be able to recognize this one and always call out the arguer when they use this one. Okay, what's next? Yes. My political opponents are I don't call them by their own names. I make up a derogatory nickname for them. I have no argument against them, so I'll just call them by a derogatory nickname. The non sequitur is good. They don't usually follow this philosophical formalism, like men are human, Mary is human, therefore Mary is a man. They're more subtle than that, like my example. Conclusion that does not follow necessarily. Okay. The false dichotomy. You're either part of the problem or part of the solution. You're either with us or against us. Or paraphrasing what C.S. Lewis apparently said, either Jesus was the son of God, sorry for the typo, son of God, or he was a madman. Well, those aren't the only two options. The fallacy is to say that those are the only two options. Another similar one is still similar to the either or fallacy is what has been called the Arthur Conan Doyle fallacy, that once you have excluded all the impossible, whatever's left, however probable must be true. And the reason that is a fallacy is because there's no way any person can know that they have eliminated all the possibilities. There's always something, it's always possible there's something you don't know about. So that Conan Doyle fallacy is one that you hear often, but don't take it as true. Okay. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc. Since it came after, it was caused by. Like first the rooster crowed, then the sun came up, so the rooster caused it. Well, you would know, you would recognize that as a fallacy, but the next slide is a more subtle one. Trump produced the highest employment in American history. Well, so the high employment came after Trump was elected, yes, but look at the graph. Did that cause that? That's less obvious when you see all the data. So the post hoc ergo propter hoc, the example made it seem easy to catch, but it's not always easy to catch. Okay, what's next? Tu quoque, you too, or your one too argument is used fairly often. In politics, you hear it all the time. I'm criticizing a politician for something that politician has done. And instead of hearing an answer to that, I hear an accusation of some other politician. Oh, they did the same thing, didn't they? So if you hear this, if you hear an answer that doesn't address what you said, but brings up a new accusation against a different person, then they're just using the, well, you're one too argument. Okay. Go ahead. Other ways to identify ways you could be deceived. Please look for independent verification of facts. If you are listening to a trained journalist, that journalist has been trained in ethics and in verification of sources, and they will have several sources before they report on something, and they will have those sources in their notebook. So you want to have independent verification of facts, and you want to believe people who go after independent verification of facts. If people from all backgrounds are involved in the debate, if they're knowledgeable people, you will have a better result. You'll have better information. But how do you know somebody is knowledgeable? Well, just like number one, they'll use sources. They will have done the research. They will verify their claims. They will not resort to insults and ad hominem attacks or straw man attacks, among the tactics I previously mentioned. Always be skeptical of authority figures. Always entertain multiple hypotheses. This is very important in science, and it turns out to be important whenever you're trying to decide on candidates, you're trying to decide on a course of action. If you have multiple ideas in mind, you will not be tempted to only listen to the data that agrees with your preconceived notion. And we all will favor data that agrees with our preconceived notions. So you have to fight against this. This is something scientists are trained in. We should all train in this. 5 is a similar situation. If you try to disprove your own hypothesis, this prevents you from falling in love with it to the point where you can't give it up. I've seen it happen science. It happens in science often that a person is so enamored with their own hypothesis, they cannot give it up even when it's falling apart before their eyes. And what's next? If you have numbers to make your argument, you're much stronger than if you don't have numbers. But you've got to check your sources once again. And if there's a chain of reasoning in your argument, every chain must hold up. One weak link collapses your argument. Number 8, Occam's razor. If you are introducing points in your case that really don't need to be there, then you need them at all. Don't multiply assumptions in your argument. If your argument is good, it should be able to be proven wrong. This is very true in science. I think this probably applies to other disciplines as well, in other areas of questioning. If you're making claims that can't be verified, maybe if they can't be falsified, how can they be verified? So check that your claims can be falsified, at least in principle. Okay, next. And that's all for me on always be on the lookout for faulty reasoning and rhetorical fallacies. And I hope these suggestions help, especially my suggestion to check out Carl Sagan's baloney detection kit. I think it's very helpful. Thank you, Katie. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Freeland. Next up, we have Dr. Koop Berry. Dr. Berry is a professor of government and foreign affairs here at Walsh University. She is the founder and director of the All Politics is Local conference, and her research interests have included refugees, the effectiveness of UN peacekeeping, failed states, and militarization in developing countries. So I am going to turn it over to Dr. Berry.
You need to, am I host so that I can share screen?
You should be able to share screen.
This is going to require me to work two hands at one time. It might be hard, but I think I can do it. Thank you all for coming. This is a really important topic for the United States. Everybody can see the shape we are in. January 6th told us something about ourselves, something that doesn't reflect well on any of us in all reality. The picture that I have up there is from the National Endowment for Democracy. And I thought it was a great visual of disinformation. We have the apple, that's what we see, but somebody else is seeing the apple eaten. And so disinformation, I'm going to talk about it as far as it relates to democracy in the time of COVID. Afterwards, if you want to talk about some of the other disinformation, but most of the presentation focuses on COVID examples. So, okay. And Nick, I think I need you back because this isn't use the computer. There we go. Okay. So when we talk about misinformation and disinformation, then use keyboard left it. Okay, got it. When we're talking about misinformation versus disinformation, most of what I'm going to talk about is disinformation, and it's different. Misinformation is false, it's inaccurate, it's misleading, so something's wrong with it, but we're going to see that the intent behind it's going to be different from disinformation. So when you think of misinformation, think of the game of telephone. I'm going to tell Katie something, then Katie's going to tell Dr. Scott something, then Dr. Scott's going to tell Lisa something. And by the time it gets to Dr. Beach, there's going to be some inaccuracies in what went from, started and got to the end. We can also think of misinformation as something a newspaper or a radio or television news gets wrong. And then they have to come back and they correct it. And so misinformation is not saying that it's not wrong, that they get something wrong, but the intent is not to deceive. Disinformation, though, is different. And disinformation is what is hurting us at this point in our political history. Disinformation is the deliberate spread of false or misleading material. That material comes out looking factual. It looks like it's news. So it's going to be hard for people to tell the difference between the two. And note that disinformation, there's a willful intent to deceive. I want to get you to believe this. I want you to believe something that is inaccurate. And as Dr. Freeland talked about some of this, disinformation is going to differ from, say, the misinformation, because if a newspaper publishes something wrong, they have to publish the correction. Disinformation doesn't do that. You don't have the same standards of accuracy, the same standard of truth. Dr. Freeland also talked about the role of fear behind some of the logical fallacies that we all fall prey to at times. And disinformation intentionally, and again, note the intention here, preys on our fears, preys on the things that worry us, things we're insecure about, preys on social divisions, and we're a very divided country right now. It preys on ideological polarization. And we're going to see for the United States, this is going to be a big problem because what has made the United States a successful democracy is that we've had this large middle. Most of us swing around the center right, center left, but we're in the center. And so we see that we're moving away from that center at this point. And one of the reasons why disinformation has become so satisfying is because it has a tendency to confirm the world as we want to see it, the world that the way we think about it, which is a lazy way of looking at the world. When I was growing up, my mother would always say, "Oh, I never promised you a rose garden." Life is tough. And it doesn't always go the way we want it to. And so that was something we learned to live with. It's something that made us willing to roll with the punches, willing to compromise. And we see less of that willingness anymore. And so somebody out there is taking the disinformation, preying on maybe a little bit of our laziness, a little bit of our wishful thinking, and then manipulating it for their purposes. Now, the reason why disinformation is really important to understand is that it impacts our democracy. And the US is going to be the first sustained democratic country. And James Madison, the founder, well, he's one of the founding fathers, but he's also the predominant writer for the US Constitution. And he's going to say a popular government without popular information, meaning common information, things that we as a group, as a country, think is generally accurate. And so without this popular information that kind of binds us together, or the means of acquiring that popular information, is a prelude to a farce or a tragedy. We're going to fail. If we don't have something that binds us, these common ideas, a common body of knowledge, not everything, but some of it, most of it in common, we're going to be a joke. And that's kind of what it looks like. Thomas Jefferson says that a well-informed electorate is a prerequisite to a democracy. And we're going to see that that's really accurate as well. De Tocqueville talks a fair amount about this as he chronicles democracy in America in the 1830s. And he talked about how there was a whole body of common information. Not that there weren't different views, but most of what people thought were true was held in common by the majority of the people at the time. And the founders, as they're writing the Federalist Papers and they're talking about reasons why we need to come together and how we should come together, their primary concern is that if we didn't have this national identity, that popular information that James Madison talked about, being well informed that Thomas Jefferson talks about, we were going to be vulnerable to internal divisions and external manipulations. Now, it's a good thing we don't see any of that right now, right? Internal divisions or external manipulations. Right, we're exactly where the founders were worried that we would be, because we lack this popular information, what most of us think is true. And so for a democracy needs multiple things in all reality, but it needs informed citizens, It needs us to be willing to participate, to work with others who don't necessarily agree with us, informed citizens who can express their opinions, can accept the preferences of others. When we have that, then we get this next thing, a level of trust between citizens. And we know that trust is a little bit in short supply. Trust in our fellow citizens, but trust in our rulers and our institutions, that we think they're legitimate. And so democracy requires trust, and trust requires some level of relationship and confidence between the citizenry, among the citizenry. And this disinformation that's dividing us has really compromised the trust that we had in our fellow citizens. It's going to require some shared sense of reality. And disinformation eats away at that shared sense of reality. And so without this trust between ourselves as citizens, with our government, legitimacy erodes and governing becomes very, very difficult. Hard to make policy then. So this is dangerous to democracy for all kinds of reasons. Some of these, I'm going to apply them to COVID in the next slide, but we're going to be able to apply them to issues of the election, to what happened on January 6th. So we're going to see that if people don't believe what they hear or trust the institutions, how are they going to make good choices? If I'm getting a lot of disinformation, then I can't make a well-informed choice. And the reality is there are choices between politicians. We think they're not, but there really are. And so how do we make these well-informed choices? How do we sort out the disinformation? And if we are threatened by that, if we lack confidence in ourselves, then we're going to have apathy. And we're not going to go and participate. We're not going to listen to the debates. We're not going to come to programs on misinformation and disinformation. We're going to see the apathy or the sowing doubt. That's really going to impact Georgia in the election, right? The runoff election. A lot of people didn't turn out. And that's going to hurt. In that case, it hurt the Republicans more than it did the Democrats. In the 2016 election, it hurt the Democrats more than the Republicans. So note, everybody's going to lose as a result of disinformation in all reality. All this disinformation increases the notion that all news is fake and there are no reliable facts. There really are facts. There's no doubt about that. People can tell you that they're not, but there are a set of clear facts. Dr. Freeland says, see if they're verifiable, test them. One of my favorite things, question authority, right? Where does this information come from? Why are they saying that? What's the intent behind it? And so, but if we're worried because there's all this information out there, then my insecurity is going to say, there's nothing I can do about it. And so all news is fake. So I'm not going to pay attention. How do we hold our leaders accountable? Democracy is nothing if we don't hold leaders and institutions accountable. Danger to democracy because once we lose trust in our institutions, we have a democracy. The alternative to that is some level of autocracy. The left is worried about fascism. The right is worried about communism. Doesn't really matter. They're all going to oppress you. Democracy is your best bet. But it's a harder form of government because it requires more from us as citizens and as individuals. Disinformation enhances our social divisions. We have the right, we have the left, we have the red, we have the blue. We have conspiracy theorists and we have people who think, and they're conspiracy theorists on both sides. The right is, really taking precedent right now, but at one time it was the left, and so it goes back and forth. We're going to see social divisions in a graph at the end of my presentation and the impact of these divisions on our beliefs about COVID and how that's really hurt certain parts of our population. And one of the things that we really need to understand, democracy requires some level of reason. It requires me to think about what's good for you. It requires me to think about what's good for our country. Disinformation is really based on emotion. Fear tactics. Fear is the best emotion producer out there. And so they use, disinformers use fear tactics. So they manipulate our anger. January 6th, we see a lot of manipulation of people's frustration and people's anger to the disservice of some of the people who got caught up in something that was bigger than what they bargained for. Well, as a country, we're all hurt by that. So disinformation is going to be driven by financial gain. There are people making profits, making money off of this disinformation. People with political gains, their side, my side's going to win, your side's going to lose. And again, both sides have some level of guilt in all of this. At different points, one side can bear more of the burden than the other side, but both sides all prey here. And it's driven by ideological gain. Democracy requires a level of pragmatic decision-making and a lot less ideological decision-making. And so as we move towards ideology, our democracy is being destroyed. So driven by money, politics, ideology, used by all kinds of people. We know the external manipulators, Russia, China, Iran. There have been other countries, Israel was one of them. We have internal dissenters using disinformation. There are other groups using disinformation out there, both sides again. So COVID-19 doesn't actually exist. I've had people tell me this starting last March, and I have had people tell me that on Saturday. We're a year into this, and there are people that think COVID-19 doesn't exist. If you're an InfoWars fan, then you know it's a plot to take away our freedoms. The fear that COVID-19 is a virus that spread as a result of the 5G and the electromagnetic spectrum, even though you're mixing, biology and whatever that electromagnetic stuff is. Dr. Freeland can tell you about that. It's either a virus that's escaped from a Chinese lab or it was created as a biological weapon by the US military. Both of them are out there. Masks impair, do we wear a mask or do we not? And so the disinformation, and I read a lot of this over the weekend, masks impair, our oxygen, carbon dioxide exchange. And so we're really breathing in our own pollution, our own carbon dioxide. And so it's gonna lower our brain function, causes depression. There's so many inaccuracies out there. That's disinformation. The intent behind so many of them is to get us not to have confidence in science, not to have confidence in our leaders, not to have confidence in each other. And so the consequences of this disinformation. Last July, the United States has 4% of the world's population. Last July, we had 20% of the world's COVID cases. And we can thank India and Brazil for knocking us down some. Now we only have about 4.3% of the world's COVID-19 cases, still more than our population. Consequences of this disinformation. We're gonna know these. Financially, COVID has hit some groups harder than others. The working class and the poor have been the hardest hit. We do know that the top 1% have made more money through this. And we're going to see some of the unemployment almost double. It was 3.6%, historically low rates, January of last year, 6.7%, with 1.8 million new claims for unemployment last week. Some people are hit much worse. You know that businesses are closing. This number is really hard to come by. And experts are saying that we really won't know the impact of business closings until after tax season. So it really won't be until summer to fall. But by September, so just 5 months into this, over 100,000 businesses have closed. Forbes reports that 60% of those businesses that closed temporarily have now closed permanently. And so that's a big economic hit. School closings, especially at the primary level. Imagine, and Lisa Sloan can talk about this. Imagine teaching elementary school, teaching kids in low-income areas to learn to read via Zoom. The skills gap is going to really increase as a result of the school closings. Youth suicides are up significantly. One of the reasons why teachers have been moved into essential personnel, not just because what they're doing is essential, but we need to get kids back into school because suicides in places like Nevada are at epidemic rates. Kids need socialization. I need socialization. I was disappointed that I wasn't going to be out there with everybody else. You need socialization. You have all kinds of shortages, medicines, food, supplies. I have Fancy Feast cat food up there because I can't get my cat's cat food. We have food shortages, and so the byproducts aren't being shipped to the cat food companies, so they're not making as much cat food. All kinds of shortages. Isolation of significant parts of our population. We know that students, primary and secondary students, or some of them are elder population. Some of those isolated people as well. And isolation and its cognitive impact is significant. Its health impact is significant. My daughter keeps saying isolation is like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's going to kill you. These are all consequences of our COVID disinformation because we don't believe it's real. We don't trust the science. We are almost a year into this and we're still, even though all of the science shows that masks are significantly effective, we can't get some people to wear their masks. And so that holds us back and produces so many of these problems. Drug and alcohol abuse are up. I don't know if you all remember, but back in the spring, they said, oh, it's 10 o'clock in COVID time. It's time you can drink now. 10 o'clock in the morning, not in the evening or the night. And so we are going to have a lot of issues, financial, psychological, educational problems that we have to solve because we have these political problems with disinformation. And so I wanted to put this up here as well, some of the, because this shows the different impact of COVID. And so deaths as a percentage of the US population, the United States is the white population, 76%, but only 60% of COVID deaths. African-American population, I have those reversed. Sorry about that. African-American population is 13.4% of the population, but deaths are 16.2%. Hispanic, and I have that one reversed as well, sorry. Hispanic population is 16.7% and 18.2% of COVID deaths. Asian population is reversed. It is the 3.6% of the population and 5.6 of the population and 3.6 of COVID deaths. And the Native American one is accurate. less than 1% of the population, but 2% of our COVID deaths. And notice the asterisk down there. Native American population mortality rate is significantly higher than it is for white Americans. And part of that is the biology that made them more susceptible to the European diseases. This shows us not only the ethnic or cultural impact, but an economic impact as well. White populations and Asian populations tend to be wealthier. African American, Hispanic, Native American left behind economically in many ways. And so we see with disinformation our inability to come to this common conclusion that COVID is a threat that we can combat together. And if we were to pull together, we wouldn't have to have some of the things that we have today, like children learning on Zoom. And so I hope you see here that disinformation is more of a concern than misinformation. Misinformation, the intent is not to deceive or divide. Disinformation it is, and it has pretty significant impact on our country in a non-positive way. So thank you, and we'll take questions afterwards.
Hello, everyone. Again, thank you, Dr. Berry. Next up, we have Dr. Rachel Constance. Dr. Constance is the director of the Gary and Linda Byers School, Linda Byers Institute for Community Health, an associate professor of history and co-director of the Walsh University Honors Program. Let me share my screen. It's hard to talk and do the same. Her research specialties include the global history of science, technology, and medicine, with particular interests in epidemics. So I am going to turn it over to you, Rachel.
Perfect. I see it. Can you hear me okay, Katie? I just want to make sure.
Yes, I can.
Okay, awesome. So I'll let you get that to presentation mode. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Katie and to all of you for coming here to hear this presentation. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about misinformation and disinformation in history, particularly looking at different conspiracies. And all of you are probably familiar with a number of different types of conspiracy theories, and it was difficult to try to figure out which one to narrow down. You know, JFK was shot by the CIA, or Hurricane Katrina was a President Bush plot to kill off large numbers of Black people, or, you know, I mean, the list goes on and on. The moon landing was faked, right? So we know that there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there. It's not necessarily a partisan issue. But for the purposes of this panel, I thought it would be helpful to focus on a particular long-standing and pervasive strand of conspiracy theory that is connected to both misinformation and disinformation, and that is anti-Semitism. And so I'm going to look at 3 case studies here, and I have one slide, so everything, you can see what I'm going to talk about right up there. And I'm going to kind of do a genealogy of the modern day QAnon conspiracy, which is, you know, becoming pretty mainstream. A lot of people are familiar with it on some level. So I'm just going to talk about some of the roots of that. So disinformation and misinformation about children, and specifically harm to children, pedophilia, ritual sacrifice, are not new. They are also not distinctly American, although it might sometimes feel that way because we hear about those a lot here. But we can date conspiracy theories about children all the way back to the Roman period. For those of you that know history, for example, the Catalan conspiracy of the 1st century BCE, that was an aristocratic plot to overthrow the Roman Republic. And supposedly it was sworn by Roman elites who did so over the entrails of a young boy, which they sealed their pact by eating those entrails. So, but more common, we see the origins of these types of conspiracies in medieval Europe and the anti-Semitism that was pretty pervasive during that time period. So Christian kings, popes, feudal lords would use disinformation about Jewish communities. They would claim that they killed Christian children, that they would drink their blood in ritual sacrifice. This is literally where we get that term blood libel, dating back to that time period. So they would use that disinformation, which in turn would breed misinformation. Already there was some distrust of Jewish families amongst the Christian communities who were their neighbors. So they would use that as an excuse to execute those Jewish families, to scapegoat them for social or political or cultural issues going on. There's a famous case, King Philip the Fair passed disinformation about Jewish families so that he could take their property, so that was something that happened pretty frequently. Whenever something bad was happening in Europe, somebody would usually find a way to blame the Jews to do that, and they would summarily execute them. And hurting children is anathema to humans. It's one of the worst things that an individual can do. And so it serves as a really powerful way of demonizing an enemy. And the Jews, because they were culturally distinctive, they were perceived as being very wealthy. And, for Christians in particular, they had a connection to the death of Jesus, became common scapegoats for large numbers of societies, particularly in the West. So let me talk a little bit more about these 3 case studies that are, as I said, form a kind of a genealogy of QAnon here. So I already mentioned, conspiracy of Catalan. There's other examples of this blood libel thing going on. But let me talk about Nazi Germany, which is one that you are probably mostly familiar with. So I'm going to start with what you already know. So the Nazis are the most famous anti-Semites of the 1930s, but they were not the only anti-Semites in the West. Anti-Jewish sentiment was common all over Europe and the United States. And this hostility was driven in part by a fake document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was printed in Russia in 1903. And it alleged that Jews were engaged in a plot to take over the world. And this document radicalized a number of people, but this included right-wing leaders, future fascists, later on, a young Adolf Hitler being one of them, for example. And the 1930s, because of the cultural anxieties and in particular the economic anxieties, the Great Depression from that time period, ended up fostering a breeding ground for anti-Semitism. Germany in particular, at the time, had just undergone a massive political change. They had gone from being an autocratic monarchy to being a very, very young democracy. They had just lost World War I, kind of unexpectedly, at least as far as most of the German population was concerned. And because of that loss in World War I and the fact that the new democracy was struggling under economic sanctions from the winners of World War I, led people to start looking for scapegoats. And so Germans began blaming the Jews for their loss in the war, and Hitler was and the Nazi Party, generally speaking, amplified that sort of undercurrent. So misinformation in that sense goes on to become disinformation. So it's a from the bottom up type of thing. And so the Nazi Party rose to power on a multi-platform, at least basically blaming lots of other people for Germany's problems. So it was an anti-Semitic platform, so it was anti-Jewish. They were anti-communist, and they were anti-capitalist. And I just want to add a note here that in spite of the fact that the Nazis had the word socialist in their party name, they were not socialists. In fact, Hitler hated socialists, he hated communists, he hated capitalists, he thought all of them were run by Jews. And if that sounds like it makes no sense, it's because it doesn't make sense. You have to just operate on the understanding that Hitler's worldview was distinctly, anti-Jewish. And so anything that he didn't like was a Jewish plot. So it's something to kind of keep in the back of your mind. one of the things that the Nazis did when they came into power was they gave every single family in Germany a free radio. And then they proceeded to basically make the free radio channels, or make their radio channels, state propaganda. And so they were able to spread this anti-Semitic message via their own state-run radio. And the German population was starved of alternative perspectives. They were controlled, they were educated by state-run education institutions, and many of them already had existing anti-Semitic feelings, whether some of them were overt, some of them were sort of like not fully at the top of their consciousness. But as a result of these actions, the Nazis were able to convince people to either look the other way when they started actively persecuting the Jews, or in the worst case scenario, actually bringing them in to, rob their stores, break their windows. And ultimately, it resulted in the murder of 6 million Jews in death camps across Europe's, the Holocaust, what we know of. And so there were real life consequences to this very active propaganda campaign that was built on, this long running conspiracy theory about who the Jews were and what they did. And this theme about, how Jews treated children and the anxiety, that the Nazis were deeply anxious about Jews reproducing with Germans and destroying the purity of the German bloodline. And so this idea about, Jewish children and Jewish people generally intermixing is a major theme of Nazi propaganda. So the second case study I want to talk about is the McMartin preschool scandal. So this predates me. So I'm speaking from a historical perspective, but some of you on here may be familiar with this. So in this horrific conspiracy theory, this was another mainstream one, very similar to QAnon, that happened during the 1980s. And so the story went that there were children who were being sodomized in secret underground tunnels, children who were forced to watch their captors drink blood in front of them, children who were tortured in ritual sacrifice and filmed for pornography. And this became a massive news story spread by reputable news sources all over the country. And the catalyst was an accusation by a young boy's mother in 1983 that basically metastasized, I can think of the word, into this massive belief that there was, basically an underground pedophilia ring being run under Manhattan Beach, California, in tunnels underneath Manhattan Beach, California. And it triggered a full-on mass hysteria. And it led to hundreds of daycares across the country being accused of facilitating pedophilia and ultimately child sex trafficking. And, the accusations were bolstered by confessions that were forced out of children, coerced or coaxed out of children, and hundreds of people were put on trial unjustly on sex trafficking and sex trafficking and pedophilia causes. And, when all of the hysteria died down, as it turned out, the original accuser, a woman by the name of Judy Johnson, it turned out she was a paranoid schizophrenic. And so we see in this case, this is more misinformation that gets picked up by the mainstream. And, as the story gains power, it becomes increasingly, accepted and normalized. So that brings us to our third case study here, which is Pizzagate and the rise of QAnon, which all of you probably are familiar with on some level, some maybe better than others. So just a brief overview. Pizzagate bears a very strong resemblance to the McMartin preschool scandal in that it deals again with this concern about a pedophilic ring. So it emerged during the 2016 presidential campaign, and basically it alleged that prominent Democrats were running a child sex trafficking ring in tunnels beneath the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria in Washington, D.C. And again, the story was carried by mainstream media outlets, although this time it was skeptically. So basically it was presented more like this is happening, but they debunked it. They said, no, there's no evidence that this is true. Now on what we might call non-mainstream media, or, on like talk shows and that sort of thing, it was treated a little bit more seriously. So, and it found new life on various internet websites and social media. So for example, 4chan, 8kun, Reddit, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. And it was also given life on Fox News commentators, not Fox News journalists, but on you know, the shows that people like to watch where they talk about politics. So, and then the culmination of the spread of this conspiracy theory was when a shooter entered that pizzeria and fired shots. When he was arrested, he claimed to be there to save the children. He believed he was going there to save the children who were, you know, being held captive under this pizzeria. And it was a conspiracy theory that really had a life of its own. It was further along after the release of John Podesta's emails by WikiLeaks. John Podesta was an advisor to Hillary Clinton, then a presidential candidate. And people created interpretations of these emails. So they dug through his emails and they looked at the menu of this pizza place. And so, you know, they created an entire like connection. So for example, the word hot dog, they believed meant a boy. So if you ordered a hot dog at this pizzeria, that meant you wanted a young boy to have sex with. If you ordered cheese, that meant a girl, so on and so forth. I mean, it was an incredibly elaborately developed conspiracy theory. And Pizzagate eventually morphed into a much larger and now mainstream conspiracy theory that's called, we call it QAnon. And it postulates that former President Donald Trump was on the verge perpetually of arresting a large number of liberal elites. So this would include celebrities, lawmakers, other sorts of folks, for their facilitation and participation in a widespread child sex ring. And so like Pizzagate, QAnon is housed largely on social media, typically far-right websites, although references to it appear frequently in what you might, some people call the mainstream media. But again, it's referenced mainly as this is a completely false theory. So again, it's presented as this is happening, but it's not true. So it needs to be reported on because it has real world effects, but it, you know, they try to treat it as there's no evidence that this is happening. And so the increasing personalization of media, the algorithms that feed us the content that we like, you know, if something pops up on Twitter or Facebook that you're uncomfortable with, you can just say, don't show me this again, and they won't. But the result is that there's an echo chamber that's very, very similar to what happened with Nazi Germany, where all those free radios were used as, you know, to feed what, you know, Nazis wanted people to hear. In this case, this echo chamber feeds you only what you want to hear. There's nobody, you know, and by you, I mean anybody. I mean, it's not a partisan issue in the sense that like everybody has curated their own news, what they want to read. Okay, so I see the things that I like, you see the things that you like. And so the result is that people get deeper and deeper beliefs about whatever is reinforcing their own worldview. You know, Dr. Berry talked briefly about that and the harm that that can cause. And it deepened their belief in this conspiracy theory, this QAnon conspiracy theory. And there's limited exposure to multiple perspectives now and to critical thinking. And no one is immune to this. Even somebody who is highly educated, who is well-trained can fall victim to these types of conspiracy theories. You know, and there's probably psychological reasons why that happens. That's out of my wheelhouse. What I do want to talk about is how to kind of bring all this together. Why is this a historical pattern, right? So we often say as historians that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So it may not repeat, but history does rhyme. So why do we see this continued pattern? So some of this is just general brain wiring. It has to do with the way that we are as humans. Conspiracy theories give us a sense of community. It creates a logical framework for understanding the world. In that sense, it can operate a lot like religion does, in that it provides that sense of cultural cohesion. But generally speaking, if we want to look at it from a sociocultural perspective, conspiracy theories like QAnon, like Pizzagate, you know, all the blood libel stories, these typically come up during periods of social and cultural change or social and cultural disruption. So in the medieval era, attacks on Jews typically happened after a major disaster. So a lot of Jews, for example, were murdered during the Black Plague of the 1300s because they were blamed for it, right? So they were looking for somebody to blame, and the Jews were an easy scapegoat for that. The Nazis, you know, their conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism was driven in part by their World War I loss and the Great Depression and the horrific economic conditions that Germany was dealing with. And people wanted to try to make sense of the world. They couldn't understand everything that they had known about themselves, the greatness of Germany, from when they were under the Kaiser. They had been fed story after story by their leaders that they were winning the war, and then one day they just surrendered, right? So in order to make sense of that, the only way that they could make sense of that was somebody betrayed us, right? The stab in the back theory. The McMartin scandal reflected a number of social and cultural changes in the United States that had begun in the 1970s. So women entering the workforce meant a growth in the number of daycares in the United States. And that's triggered a lot of anxiety about the loss of the traditional family. And this was exacerbated by economic issues in the 1980s and the decline of industrial jobs. You might remember industrial jobs used to pay really well, and a man could have his wife stay at home and raise a family on factory jobs. And by the 1980s, that was no longer true. So working class men were being sent to the unemployment lines, women had to go to work, children were being sent to daycare, and suddenly daycare in the 1980s became this massive sort of cultural bugaboo. It was a place where children were not safe, right? So that conspiracy theory really reflects that. Pizzagate and QAnon, we're still pretty close to it, but the consensus is growing that this is also driven by social changes that make people anxious. The legalization of same-sex marriage, for example, the rising visibility of transgender people, Hillary Clinton being the first woman running on a major presidential ticket, growing differences and divisions between Democrats and Republicans, racial unrests, anxiety about the economy, immigration, climate change, the disappearance of jobs. I mean, you name it. This is a tough time. We're going through a lot of transitions. And again, conspiracy theories can really provide a lot of comfort for people the same way that religion can. And so a lot of people keep turning to this because they're seeking out that community. They're seeking out this sense of being part of something bigger than them. And that's really what's going on there. So to just kind of wrap everything up, conspiracy theories and the misinformation and the disinformation that guide them, they serve a specific social function. They give us that stability, that community, especially to people who are anxious about themselves, their lives, people who are, unemployed in some cases, or anybody who's uncertain about the future or feel like something bad is going to happen to them. But until the underlying social causes or economic causes of these conspiracies are addressed, they can and do cause unmitigated harm to the people that they demonize and further contribute to the fracturing of societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Constance. That was wonderful. I wrote my honors thesis here at Walsh about some of those same topics with Nazi Germany. Next up, our panelist is Dr. Ron Scott. Dr. Scott is the chair of the Division of Literature, Language, and Communication. He's a professor of English and the coordinator of freshman composition here at Walsh. He's a fan of being outdoors and told us that he finds how conspiracy theories spreads really interesting. So we definitely wanted to invite him today. So, Dr. Scott, I'm going to go ahead and let you share your presentation.
All right, thanks, Katie. Thanks to everybody who came. Really happy that you guys came. While I'm sharing my presentation, if you could do me a favor in chat, have you heard of Gatorgate? Wow, I can say it right. Gamergate, yes or no? Just yes or no in chat. All right, I will move my presentation all the way to the back. Sorry. All right, so Gamergate or disinformation goes mainstream. I'm going to be checking on you all in chat here in a little bit, so make sure that you're ready. Sorry, I just jumped a couple screens. I'll be right back. There we go. So I'm going to try to draw some connections. My presentation is 12 minutes. I promise you, I will wrap it up by then. I'm going to try to draw some connections. What we've talked a lot about are lots of conspiracy theories and ways the misinformation gets spread. I'm going to talk about one direct case study that shows the power of our technoculture and social media. We can draw a direct line from Gamergate to the rise of online harassment and bullying, and all caused by the willful spread of misinformation. All right, so you all have probably heard the term. Oh, by the way, this is Wizard of Oz, right? Unleash the flying monkeys. This is a term that's happened on the web when somebody may disagree with you on social media, and all of a sudden, the next thing you know, you are bombarded by all kinds of folks who you do not know. They are in your social media. They're all over the place. Full disclosure, I got off Facebook in 2007, so I'm not a Facebook person. I've been there a long, long time. But these are the sorts of folks who show up and argue with you in ways you completely don't understand. All right, so Gamergate. Gamergate obviously comes, it's a play, as many of these terms are, of the term Watergate. In 2013, a game is released called Depression Quest, developed by Zoe Quinn. She was developer of a lot of other games. She had mental health issues, right? So she suffered from severe depression. Depression Quest got great reviews from the game press. Lots of people were really talking about what an interesting game it was, how it really helped you understand what people who are going through depression go through. Not everybody was so excited about it, however, right? So the conversation that subsequently happens shows this way that when a culture is attacked, much as Dr. Constance talked about, all of a sudden lines get drawn very, very firmly, and misinformation becomes promulgated in ways that are not beneficial to anybody. All right, so the hardcore gamer community, which is almost entirely male, believed that Quinn had gotten these positive reviews for her game because she had seduced game reviewers. This was an accusation made by her ex-boyfriend in a incredibly long Reddit post, pretty much after the reviews came about. So there was the flying monkeys pretty much jumped on Zoe Quinn and attacked her, saying that there's no way, no game like this could be one that anybody would care about. What are we talking about? Depression Quest. I want a game where I can go have the best gun. That's what a game is all about, right? All right. So fellow game developers of hers came to her defense, especially a lot of women. And we had a sort of an all-out game culture war. Here's a picture of Zoe Quinn. She survived these things. She's still a game developer, but she took a lot of heat. All right. Depression Quest. Here's a screenshot from the game's website. As you can see, it is not your typical computer game. It's an interactive nonfiction about living with depression. It runs through dialogue. You type things into the computer. You use Polaroid shots. It's a fascinating game. If you've got a chance, I would highly recommend you playing it. I think it's still $10. If you have any interest in mental health, it's well worth your time. So this game is developed in a framework we know it's not going to make tons and tons of money. It's not being sold for $60 a pop. It's not available on any of the consoles. It is strictly a PC game for folks who are very, very interested in these sort of small stories that are told interactively. As many of the folks who were mad at Zoe Quinn and the folks who defended her, people like Lee Alexander from Gama Sutra, a game review site, and Anita Sarkeesian, who's another game scholar, discovered this marks a cultural shift. And so a lot of people ask me oftentimes, I write a lot about games, and they ask me, why do we care about games? Games are dumb, right? Well, perhaps, but this moment in particular marked a cultural shift in which we move from games that are dominated by a specific culture, right? A game culture dominated by mostly young men, dominated by their values, aggression, and combat, places where you can sort of live out your fantasies of hyper masculinity, into games that suddenly feature female characters who are real, all kinds of characters of all kinds of genders, and not simply these sort of spectacular visions that we see of game character or spectacle visions of women in games. Mysteriously, women never seem to need armor in games. I don't know why that is. So this sort of game, and as these folks recognized, Depression Quest, their argument was nobody could like these games. These positive reviews must be brought about by cheating. It becomes an indictment on the entire game review industry and the development of these kind of games themselves. If you want any sort of source for this, I can point you to about 1 million 4chan posts that talk about how Depression Quest was not a true game. It's not really a game. All right. So clearly what we're running into is gamer culture as a construct. This games and the ecosystem that form games take a lot of views and tropes from our culture, right? From mainstream narratives. The trope is one that says men are dominate technology. Women are not good at technology. What are you talking about? Clearly, women can't develop games. They're not good at coding and programming, that kind of thing, right? Sherry Todd offers this point in an article that she published in Women's Studies Journals in 2015. The context of online games are now better understood as social and cultural environments that consist of a diverse range of social networks where emotions, thoughts, and concerns are a felt experience by those participating within these settings. This is not how hardcore gamer culture wants to think about games, right? Hardcore gamer culture wants to think about games as, nope, this is a natural realm of men. All right, so obviously that's determined by the complex series of tropes from mainstream narratives. Gamergate happens because some gamers perceive Depression Quest as a threat. And they're right. After this game, there's all kinds of different games that are developed. I'll talk about those a little bit more later, but there's other consequences as well, right? Doxing and other forms of online harassment take off. Death threats are all over the place. Zoe Quinn personally moves either 8 or 9 times because she is threatened constantly. Gama Sutra, the game review website that defended her, actually loses its advertising from Intel for a month because somebody contacted Intel and said, hey, you're promoting a corrupt site. And the powers that be at Intel quickly figured out that that was not true, but a month's worth of advertising is a significant amount of money, right? Defenders of Quinn and diversification of gaming get attacked as social justice warriors and white knights. We even get a couple alt-right media sensations. This one sort of disappeared, but Milo Yiannopoulos, he launched himself based on hashtag Gamergate, and he amplified the attacks and the misinformation. Just a reminder, none of these accusations against Zoe Quinn or the game review industry were true. All right, so as we finish up then, right, the moral arc of the universe and the famous quote that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Reworked from the abolitionists, the moral arc of the universe. We see that, we hope that these sorts of things, this misinformation, as Dr. Barry and Freeland and Dr. Constance all talked about, gets exposed. Disinformation gets discovered. The cultural shift is not really that dangerous for the people who attacked the makers of Depression Quest and her defenders. This is from an article that's not quite yet published. It's coming out in the summer by Breger and Moeller. Would-be hardcore gamers and hashtag Gamergaters need not have panicked. There are still plenty of AAA game titles to play, and there's always your annual installments from the Call of Duty franchise, right? Hardcore gamer culture was not broken up. What would happen is the constructions on which it was built were exposed. If you still want to go live your hyper-masculinized fantasy life online, you can do it. There's plenty of games out there for you. All right, and hopefully they will bend towards justice. As we've talked about, these sorts of tropes from mainstream culture get picked up into these side cultures in ways that become naturalized. We start to think that, hey, wait a second, technology is the realm of men. When a game comes out like Depression Quest that shows this sort of different way to look at games, people's feelings get sort of so badly hurt that they unleash the flying monkeys. Games that have come out since, and there's some fascinating games. There are games about coming out as a member of the LGBTQ community. There are games about children having cancer. There are, and what the stress of that. There are games of about living with types of abuse and escaping from those sorts of things. There's all kinds of games now that take this narrative point and click form, telling far different stories. And if you ever want a list, I'm happy to provide you one, because I play them and write about them all the time. All right, so I think that the last piece then here is another quote from Sherry Todd. Not only had these attacks on women heightened concerns relating to how gaming is being portrayed via the media, which in turn affects public perceptions of gaming, they have also effectively demonstrated the extent to which sexism and misogyny have become culturally embedded over time. So I'll leave you with this. Misinformation and disinformation, as Dr. Constance talked about, can be fought. It requires a lot of vigilance and a desire to speak in the face of online and physical attacks in ways that not everybody is comfortable with doing. And with that, I'm going to check to see who's heard of Gamergate, and thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. Next up, before we do that, I want to apologize. We are running a little long, but we definitely want to hear from Professor Jennifer Vokoun. She is the director of the Food Design Institute and an associate professor of graphic design here at Walsh. She's published several articles on design thinking and also serves as the chair of the Stark County Food Council. So I'm going to let you take it away, Professor Vokoun.
There we go. All right, well, thank you all. So this presentation is thinking about image manipulation and its contribution to mis and disinformation. So seeing is believing, and that can be a problem. We know that all photographs or digital images are manipulated in the way that they look and how they are received. Based on when they're taken. We only need to look at the images that Katie has provided to introduce all of the academics to know that, they capture a moment in time. And you can believe that we're 10 years younger or 20 years younger. Because again, images are about when they are sent to people, when they're taken, when they're uploaded, when they're printed, and all of that can influence us. Since the advent of photography, we believe that photographs capture what is seen. We believe them to be credible. Seeing is believing. But this belief is influenced by the way the image is presented and what accompanies it, right? We've all seen the images where somebody's holding up the Leaning Tower of Pisa. We know that's not true, but we can position ourselves so that it looks like that. We know that any image can be manipulated. We really should not believe any image we see, but we do. We are wired to believe this visual content is real, helping us to make sense of the world around us. But in believing what we see, how are we contributing to misinformation? Image manipulation is not new, particularly with photography. It's been happening since photography was invented. With digital tools, it's now a lot easier to do. Everybody just needs to think of the recent Bernie photographs where a student actually created a program where you could go and put them anywhere. Here you have an altered photo and the original photo. And you can see that in this stately scene with General Sherman and all of his generals, that one of the generals was not able to make it that day. And so they actually had to add him in after the fact. But what's curious is that you might actually think that the first photo that I showed you, where the general was not there in the right-hand corner, was the one that was the one that had been altered, that maybe the general had been taken out. Here you have a Civil War photo. What gets curious is if you start to do some examination that says the president file, it says Grant Civil War with generals. But then if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, it says composite photo. And that's because in actuality, the reality is that this image is a composite of 3 different photographs, all taken in 1864. But as you can see, the copyright of the photo is 1902, which is long after the Civil War's end. These photos, this composite that was created, was put together by Levin Handy, who was actually the nephew of Matthew Brady, as you all know, who was the famed Civil War photographer. And so he had access to all of those negatives to compile this image. You may have also heard of the Cottingley fairies from the 1920s, a series of photos of fairies that captured the attention of the world. These photos taken by 2 young girls, they were cousins, Frances and Elsie, and photographic experts examined these photos and they determined that they were genuine, at least genuine in terms of the fact that the photographs themselves had not been altered. They could not authenticate the fact that the fairies were real, just that the photograph was not altered. These, again, came out in the 1920s, just after World War I. And so spiritualists promoted them as proof of existence of supernatural creatures. And many people believed it. And that speaks to the time and the context of post-World War I, when people were probably vulnerable to believing because of the emotional bruising that had occurred during that time. It wasn't until the 1970s when these were authentically disproven and when one of the girls in the 1980s actually said that yes, these fairies were cutouts that they had placed in front of them when they did the photograph. Here, take a look and see if you can figure out what might be different. You have the cover of National Geographic in 1983, and this is actually one of the first high-profile cases of digital manipulation. The horizontal image was slightly altered to fit in the vertical format of the magazine. So if you take a look very, very closely on the original photo, you'll see this little notch. And when you go over here, you can see where that notch is in comparison to where it is here. They moved one of the pyramids a little bit closer so that it would fit into that vertical format. And the editor at the time didn't think it was very much of a big deal. However, it did cause the magazine to lose some credibility. And they did get a new editor after that who said that they would not be doing that again. But what gets lost in this conversation, the photographer was the one that noticed that this had happened and he was not happy about it. But in this conversation about kind of moving the pyramids around, the discussion about the fact that he actually hired the riders to walk in front of the pyramids to take the picture kind of went to the wayside, which could also be considered a form of manipulation. So there are times when we are more susceptible to fake images, times of high emotions. And so natural disasters are one, political turmoil, cultural shifts. And so here's an example of Hurricane Sandy and some of the images that came out on social media at that time. Here you have a picture of the tomb of the unknown soldier. And it was reported to be during Hurricane Sandy, and it just spread like wildfire on the internet. But the photo was actually taken before Hurricane Sandy. This is the actual image during the hurricane. And so this speaks to that idea of just misinformation, right? It's just not accurate. Here you have a picture of Hurricane Sandy, and the Statue of Liberty is being pummeled by this very large wave, as you can see, captured by LiveCam New York 1 at 12:12 p.m. However, if you are a fan of natural disaster movies, you may recognize this wave from The Day After Tomorrow. So what gets challenging is this placement of this news graphic on top of this image, so that if you were to easily scan this, you might think that it was true. And of course, there are the shark photos. No, there is not a shark swimming down the Interstate 75 after Hurricane Irma or any of the other hurricanes. This is a fake photo that it seems to pop up every time there is a hurricane, and people spread it and spread it and send it and send it. It's actually a photo that was from a National Geographic photographer. This is the actual shark and the kayaker. But as you can see, it has been used many, many times. And again, it's this idea that the nation is more susceptible to the spread of false images when we are going through something. And so emotion, like Dr. Berry had said, plays into that idea of fear, whether it be politics or some type of social debate or heated cultural issues. Natural disasters also fall into this category. So how is it done? And this is where, as a designer, I've been using Photoshop since it was invented. And what's been interesting to see is over the past 30 years, it just celebrated its 30 years last year, is that it has actually made its way into the dictionary as a verb, photoshopping. Around 2007, 2008, you started to hear it being used by different organizations as a way to reference what was happening in terms of, people's, particularly celebrities, their images being doctored or photoshopped. And so now we use it as a term that actually just refers to digital image manipulation, right? So it could be that you've used any kind of free software or tool that's available to you on the internet, and it may be referred to as Photoshop. And so, they added it to the dictionary because it became clear that people were using this term to reference digital imaging manipulation, and that it's just easier to say, even though Adobe would like you to say Adobe Photoshop with the little, registration marks as you kind of say those things. And of course, a conversation about digital images would not be complete without mentioning this idea of deepfakes. So this is kind of the 21st century moving forward from Photoshop, where we're now taking these videos and manipulating them with artificial intelligence. So deepfake is a form of artificial intelligence, and it combines the words deep learning and fake. And it can produce, as we have seen, particularly in the political and the, definitely in Hollywood, it can provide these persuasive counterfeit images, and it does so by studying kind of facial recognition and manipulating them. You can think of the movie Forrest Gump, and when Forrest Gump meets the president, putting people in different contexts and places. So like Dr. Berry had indicated, misinformation, somebody has unintentionally shares bad information. And so in this case, the person sharing the image isn't necessarily malicious. They could be sharing a real photo with the wrong timing, like those images of the tomb of the unknown soldier. And disinformation it's a lie, right? A person is trying to intentionally mislead. Images are photoshopped or doctored, and the context is removed. And it could be a prankster who's just trying to create, a little bit of interest in life, or it could be a person trying to advance a political goal. So the real question is like, how do we know? So when we're looking at these images and we're going through social media, how do we know? So I would ask you to take a second to think about this image and decide whether it is real or manipulated. Okay, I'm going to hold you to your answer. It is in fact real. So the verification process that was used to determine this by The Guardian, they got this photograph of this very large beach ball. If you look here, you can see the double-decker bus. So it is a very large beach ball, and to determine if it was real or not. And so they used tools like reverse image search, which you can do on Google or TinEye, to verify it was not from another news outlet. They emailed the actual user, so trying to verify who took the photograph. They could verify the place and location on Google Street View. And then they checked Twitter. So they were kind of investigating, are people talking about this? Because it seems to us if there's a big beach ball in the middle of the street, that there might be some activity talking about that. And then the user did return the phone call to verify that the image had been taken. So the process involves establishing the author of the image using things like the reverse image search, Google, Bing, TinEye, corroborating the location and the date and the approximate time of the image that it was taken. So you can do this through Google Maps. You can check weather conditions for the date the photo is supposedly taken. You can confirm the image is what it is labeled and suggested to be showing. And of course, then obtain permission from the author to use the images. Another way that you can look at images, and this goes into a little bit more detail, but it is one way that people can identify if an image has been manipulated, is to look at digital image forensics. And there are free tools online available to do this. One looks at error level analysis. And so this actually looks at things like noise and some of the compression rates that happens in an image. And so some of the tools that we have available, like Photoshop, allow us to see these things. So here you have an image on the left and then what it looks like in terms of that ELA. And so this is an image that has not been manipulated. Here you have an image where we've gone ahead and put in some duplication. So you can see that these books have kind of been duplicated. And of course, then the dinosaur has been added. And you can see that those are more visible in terms of that error level analysis. So again, it has to it speaks to kind of the noise that's occurring in the image and the compression rates. So there are tools to determine kind of, you know, how images have been manipulated moving forward. And some are really obvious, right? And some are really hard to tell. And so some of the things that we can do personally, you know, if we're not using, you know, digital forensic software, it's just really to check ourselves. Does it just seem weird, right? Well, then really you need to kind of question it. You can look for clones. In Photoshop, we have a cloning tool where we can, like, you know, duplicate ourselves or anything else. Patterns, seams where things, you know, connect. Does the body match the head to the body? You know, that's we often see that on, you know, in the grocery store aisle, in some of the tabloids, that we clearly recognize that the face does not go with the body. So you can zoom in and check for metadata. You can enlarge and look for things like soft focus. You know, sometimes we like use Photoshop to kind of feather or kind of really soften where things connect when we're making an image. And you can check for lighting and shadows. If you look at an image, one of the things that can be a telltale sign that it is a fake image is that you'll have different shadows going in different directions, right? The lighting just doesn't add up. You can validate the weather, and as mentioned, you can use available software tools. So why is it so effective? We are used to photographs being used in photojournalism and serving as proof that an event happened. And so when we see a photograph, we can more quickly retrieve related information from that memory. And this tends to signal, regardless of the fact if it's true or not, that the image information is true. And so the other thing is that pictures simply capture attention. And as scientists have figured out, is that we are just really bad at telling the fake ones from the real ones. So what can be done? Well, there are a couple of people and scientists and larger organizations, including Twitter, just announced today something called Birdwatch, where they're, you know, now really looking for people to identify misinformation, that are studying ways that we can think about how to identify these things. This study happened to focus on, you know, too often misinformation online is identified by some type of verbal cue. And the problem is that we ignore text. Right? It takes longer for us to read it. Our brains are really wired to think visually. We didn't learn how to read until later, right? To take little images of letters, put them together into words, and then read them takes more work. And so when we have a text warning, we're more likely to ignore them. And if you think about it, in the physical world, when we go driving, we have stop signs and stoplights and speed limits. And those are things that are all regulated by law. So we don't have those on the internet. The online has very few safety standards. And one study found that people took more notice of warnings with some type of assertive visual, such as above. They were trying out kind of this cracked window that looks like the surface of my phone right now, and this kind of red highlight indicating that a post may be unsafe. So finally, what I want to leave you with in terms of thinking about images and misinformation and disinformation is this idea that if it seems unbelievable, you really need to think before sharing. You know, so many of these images are playing with us having a strong emotional reaction, whether it be political or a natural disaster or something that just outrages us. So, you know, what I encourage you to take away from this conversation is to really stop, think, and evaluate the truth of the image before sending it to everybody you know. Thank you.
All right, thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you everyone who stuck with us, even though we went at this point like 15 minutes over. Panelists, let me know, do we want to take time for, you know, maybe 2 questions? Does anyone have a question? If you are with us in person, you can ask your question through Dr. Hostler. If you're joining us on Zoom, feel free to put your question in the chat. Okay, we got a question from Caitlin. Says, I had a professor tell the class during their lecture today that if Joe Biden raises the minimum wage, we won't be able to afford salad. How do we as students combat that kind of thing when it's said in our classes? That's a great question. Would one of our panelists like to give their thoughts?
I can step in. It's not my area of expertise. I was sort of hoping one of the political science folks would step in. Thanks. That's a great question. And it's something to think about. I personally am not, I think it's awkward to get into some sort of, you know, sort of tit for tat battle in that sort of situation. I would simply try to make sure that I understand very clearly that that's what the professor is arguing, and that's really what they're arguing. They might have been trying to set up a case of some sort. They might have been doing a case study. There's all kinds of possibilities. So what I would do personally is I would ask very carefully to make sure that you use your active listening skills, ask to see, is this what you were talking about? And, you know, from that point, then do your own research. There's no need to necessarily challenge them right off the bat there, I think. Others may feel differently, of course.
No, yes, and I saw a comment by a fellow librarian, Mike Jundy, who said, you know, when a professor says something like that, you know, how does that individual have the expertise to forecast the future? And, you know, you could always, if you felt comfortable, I suppose, call them out on it. We have another question, and I'm sorry, I don't think we'll be able to get to everyone's questions, but I'll save the chat and we'll answer them and just kind of disseminate that information. This is from a faculty member. He asks, how can we as faculty help students recognize and fight misinformation and disinformation? I've been trying to get them to read more newspapers, but it's been challenging. Journalism has pervasively labeled as fake news, etc. So I can say as a librarian, we really push something that we call the CRAP test. So it's an analogy that's kind of, or an anagram that's kind of funny. So hopefully they can remember it. And CRAP stands for current, relevant, authority. So again, going back to a lot of the things we've been hearing tonight. So, you know, like, who said this? Do they actually have the background to make that statement? Accuracy, and then purpose. So like, what is the purpose of whatever it is that they're looking at? So I will plug the library and say to that professor, certainly the librarians would be able to help your students, and I'm sure we could design some sort of fun game if somebody wanted to incorporate that into a lesson. Okay. All right, well, thank you, everyone. We have your other questions, and we'll get them answered to you. I want to thank everyone who joined us. I want to thank our panelists. And now it's time for me to eat dinner. All right, signing off. Thanks, everybody.